Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Fourth Presbyterian Church, and welcome to this year's Michigan Avenue Forum, Understanding Anti-Semitism. My name is Lucy Forster-Smith, and I'm the Senior Associate Pastor here at Fourth for Leadership Development, and the operative term for tonight is Adult Education. So I'm honored that the Michigan Avenue Forum falls under the work of adult education here at Fourth, and I'm honored to be the staff to the Michigan Avenue Forum committee. The purpose of the Michigan Avenue Forum is to promote civic formation within Chicagoland community by presenting events that feature important thinkers and public leaders to current issues of civic and ethical priority. That is a mouthful, but essentially what we are trying to do is to work at the intersection of church and community to raise important issues that are happening in our world and particularly in the city of Chicago. We have actually been planning this forum for many months, seeking to address some of the challenges in our city and nation that have resulted in violence and discrimination of our Jewish community. Indeed, the planning of tonight's program predates the current conflict in the Middle East, and we're deeply grieved and outraged by the violent attack on Israeli civilians by Hamas, and we grieve and stand with Palestinians, especially those in Gaza. We seek understanding and wish to contribute to reconciliation, healing, and acknowledge that the emotional responses are appropriate for such charged and traumatic events. Our program this evening seeks to understand the church's complicity in many instances, perpetuating anti-Semitism, and to explore what the role of a Christian community is in combating anti-Semitism and advancing reconciliation, healing, and care for all of the Holy's children in these times in which we're living. In our discussion this evening, we welcome the viewpoints of our panelists and understand that your views are very important. However, your views are not the positions of Fourth Presbyterian Church, and in many ways we honor the reality of that this evening. We encourage a robust and engaged discussion among our distinguished panelists, and we ask that you participate as we have reached out, as we have done it, that you participate as we have done in other Michigan Avenue forums by submitting questions either online as we are streaming this event or for our in-person audience on cards which you should have received when you came in the door this evening. There will be a moment during the proceedings this evening when you will be asked to submit questions, and then there probably will be another moment. So in other words, there'll be a couple times when you will be able to submit questions. So I am deeply grateful to our moderator, Hope Daniels, a retired journalist and professor at Columbia College. Where are you, Hope? You're over here. Columbia College in Chicago. Hope will introduce our panelists, who will make some opening remarks to us and then answer questions developed by the Michigan Avenue Forum Committee and our partners in the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs. And again, we will provide opportunity for you to submit written questions. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the contribution of our Michigan Avenue Forum Committee, Lisa Dagger and John Klum, who are our co-chairs, Marilyn Esri, who is one of the brilliant minds behind this event this evening in terms of her own personal interest in these issues and bringing that forward to our committee, Regan Burke, Cynthia Johnson, and our staff support person, Jana Blasik. And also I'm delighted, I see you way in the back, Tamar, and Carol. Tom R. is our new interim pastor who has joined us this evening and will be with us for the foreseeable future. Not sure how long that will be, but as God calls you, you are here. So Tom, we're absolutely delighted that you are here this evening. And I guess if we could have an Emerita Michigan Avenue Forum Committee category, Hope Daniels would be our Emerita committee member. And so I will now turn the program over to you, Hope.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you so much. And I join Lucy in welcoming all of you to this very, very special presentation this evening. We have an amazing panel who will share with you some inspiring and very informative comments. In fact, I've been referring to, as we've been rehearsing and talking, I've been referring to their comments as a master class. So pay close attention and have your pen and card ready to make your comments. I will introduce each panelist, and then after that's done, each panelist will have 10 minutes to just make an opening comment to you, to make an opening statement, and that could last up to 10 minutes. And then we'll begin Q&A and collecting your cards, okay? You're with me? Here we go. We are so very grateful to have Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg with us. The rabbi is a scholar in residence for the National Council on Jewish Women, and she is an award-winning author of several books, including On Repentance and Repair, Making Amends in an Unapologetic World. She is a highly sought-after keynote speaker and lecturer who has been named by Newsweek and the Daily Beast as one of 10 women rabbis to watch and one of the top most influential women rabbis in the world. Rabbi Ruttenberg. Becca Lubo is with us. And Becca is a community organizer for the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs. She works on grassroots immigration justice campaigns and education. The Jewish Council on Urban Affairs brings together various community groups to pursue justice, to ensure that everyone has safety and dignity and the resources they need to flourish. Thank you, Becca. The Reverend Nanette Sawyer. Reverend Sawyer is an associate pastor here at Fourth Church for Discipleship and Small Group Ministries. She received a Master's of Theological Studies in Comparative World Religions from Harvard Divinity School and a Master of Divinity from McCormick Theological Seminary. She has represented the PCUSA on the Interfaith Relations Commission, the National Council of Churches, and she is the author of Hospitality, the Hidden Spiritual Power of Invitation and Welcome, our panel. Thank you. So the first question is, and I would like to have each of you to respond in your own way. How would you describe the role of the church in perpetrating anti-Semitism, both historically and today?
You want to make statements first.
Oh, that's right, you do. You do want to make statements first. So, Rabbi, and then we'll just go down the...
Okay. Good evening. Okay, I'm going to do a little bit of a historical overview, and then I think we'll all have a chance to go deeper as we get into more of the questions and the Q&A and back and forth.
You know what the first question is already. So.
Yeah, we've already cheated a little bit.
We teased you.
But I'm going to do a very quick jump through time, and then you'll see where I'm going. So. Needless to say, Christianity started around zero of what we call the Common Era in academic and secular circles. And in the first centuries, there were Jews and Jewish Christians, and then there was a break, right? At a certain point, very early on, Jews very definitively said, that's not for us, right? That's our idea of Messiah is not that. And Christians said, oh, actually, we're not interested in circumcising as a precondition to Christianity or those other mitzvot, so we're going to be off on our own path. And by 70 CE, which was a very important date because that's when the Romans destroyed the temple, the second temple, which is the Jewish temple. There was a great Jewish revolt. The Jews were not very happy with the Romans, who were in charge. They were the empire driving things at that point. The Romans there was a revolt. Romans destroyed the temple. Very devastating for the Jews. Jews and Christians had decidedly split up at that point, and it was not a happy separation. All of the Gospels, pretty much, were written after the destruction of the temple. And so I would like you to think about the portrayal of the Jews in the Gospel. And I'd like you to think about the story you might tell about your ex and how you might tell that story, particularly if there is an authority that really doesn't like your ex. And you might want to have that authority's respect, or I don't know. I don't even know if that's a factor, but think about how you tell the story of your ex after the breakup versus how that might have gone in real life, okay? So we already have a different telling of the Jews in the Gospels than may have actually happened in real life. We know Jesus was a Jew. I can talk about my theories about his relationship to the Jews later. And then Constantine converts, right? Now, how convenient is it for the Romans the Romans is a Roman Christian empire, to have a narrative wherein the Romans killed Jesus? Not very convenient. They might need to be looking somewhere else for a villain of the story. Where might they go to find a villain in that story? Right. So now we're in early Christian Europe, right? Then we get to the Middle Ages, so discrimination against the Jews because the Jews have killed Jesus. As the story goes, crucifixion is a Roman construct. Jews had capital punishment, but not through crucifixion, right? Jews have been discriminated against, have been scapegoated for several centuries. And as the Middle Ages wear on, particularly after the Crusades, Jews aren't allowed to own land, particularly because there's a Christian oath that goes into land acquisition. Jews are kept out of many guilds and trades, and money lending is considered immoral in Christian circles, right? Christianity defines usury as a sin. The Jews are like, well, money lending to non-Jews is like, fine, we don't care. Jews are being taxed at astonishingly heavy rates, higher than non-Jews. There are specific taxes for Jews because of discrimination. And they're basically pushed into money lending, and it's only a couple of Jews per community, but like A, we don't care, because whatever. B, we need it because we have to survive as a community because we're being taxed at a really heavy rate. C, it's actually kind of helpful to have some liquid assets because we keep getting expelled from town to town because we get scapegoated every time something happens because we are the bad guys in everybody's story because of this story about how the Jews killed Jesus that is everywhere, and we are the infidels. Right? We are the local infidels as opposed to the Muslims who are the faraway infidels. And so we develop this story about Jews and money lending. And remember, Jews are pushed into money lending because of anti-Jewish oppression. But then this story starts about Jews and money. And it gets bigger and bigger. And then expulsions sometimes happen because somebody owes the Jews money and they don't want to have to pay. And sometimes things happen because the crops are failing, or there's a disease, or something's happening, and we have to blame somebody. And so the person in power is like, you can either be mad at me, or we can go for the scapegoat. And so, again and again and again, don't blame me, blame the Jews becomes the way to release that anger, release that pent-up feeling. Don't be angry at me, the person in power. Blame them, right? Pogrom them. Get it out at them. Steal their money. Just take it. And so, for centuries, this is what happens. And I have a map of Jewish expulsions from Europe, and it's like boom, 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 boom. It's just everywhere. At the end of the 19th century, the Tsar's secret police develop the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which takes a lot of the things that had been going on in the air, and they develop it further, describing the Jewish, it's ostensibly notes from a meeting of the Jews planning to take over the universe, take over overthrow European countries, right? That the Jews, a globalist empire, because Jews are not loyal to our country, they're loyal to each other all over different countries, right? They're global. And it's like Jews are like, dude, we're trying to be loyal to you, but you keep kicking us out, right? We would love to be good Germans, we would love to be good Poles, we would love to be good whatever, but you are making this impossible, you guys. And when the Enlightenment happens, the Jews are like, we would like to be German. Please let us be German. But it's a problem. And so this story about the Jews as this global body that are loyal to each other, but not us, and that are secretly plotting to overthrow us, is perpetrated by the Tsar so that people will blame Jews, not us, at a time when people are angry at the Tsar, right, like late 19th century, right before the 1905 revolution, right? Anger is heating up. Blame them, not me. And then it comes to America, gets translated into English. Henry Ford makes sure that copies of the protocols go out in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, at the 1920s. Blame them, not us. Right? In the interwar period, right after World War I, things are unstable. Blame them, not us. And you can see the same patterns happening in our culture today. When people talk about the globalists, people talk about Soros protesters, you see the same political cartoons with the puppeteers happening now that you did in between, in the 19th century, right? The tropes are again and again. Look up, every cartoon villain has a big nose and dark hair. The same tropes are in operation. They always have been. They're historically created, okay? It's nothing innate, and it's nothing to do with Jews, actually.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
I'm gonna stop there.
Hello. I'm grateful to be here with you all today. It's interesting, talking about how these tropes are nothing innate. They're created. I think a lot of a webinar that I once attended on anti-Semitism, and at the beginning of this webinar, the way the first speaker opened up the panel was she said, anti-Semitism is the oldest form of hatred, and it's a disease that's always been with us, and we're not going to solve it today or tomorrow or ever. Welcome to the webinar, right? And I hear that kind of thinking a lot, that anti-Semitism is a disease. And if we're going to use a metaphor, I like the metaphor of a machine, because there's nothing natural about anti-Semitism. It doesn't have to exist. Like a machine, it's created by people and can be dismantled by people. And it was created for a specific purpose, and it serves a specific purpose. It isn't random. The purpose that it often serves is when people in power need to shift blame away from society's problems, they can use the Jews to do that. That's why at different points you see Jews being blamed for both capitalism and communism, right? Whatever you're unhappy with in the world, the Jews are behind that. And that's useful for people in power. One way that that works is keeping Jews divided then from other marginalized groups, so that people in power won't be blamed for oppression, whether it's, economic oppression or other kinds of oppression. You can have a Jewish face in front to take the blame for whatever social unrest there is. And it's why anti-Semitism really requires isolating Jews, especially from other marginalized communities. And it's one reason that solidarity between Jews and other marginalized communities is really critical for fighting anti-Semitism. And we see this play out in a cycle, right? Jews will be isolated from other marginalized groups, used conveniently, and it's hard to see anti-Semitism as it's happening for a few reasons. The scholar April Rosenblum, who writes a lot about anti-Semitism, described that one reason it's hard to identify anti-Semitism sometimes is that it moves in cycles. So directly before some of the most prominent examples of anti-Jewish violence, Jews appeared to be one of society's most comfortable, well-integrated minorities. You see that with medieval Spain or modern Germany. Another reason is that anti-Semitism works best at making it appear that Jews are to blame for society's problems if it allows Jews some conditional access to privilege, success, and power. And so you see that cycle repeated, and it makes it look like, wait, there is no anti-Semitism. What's happening here? But Jews have learned from experience that success or appearing to be well integrated isn't always a guarantee of safety. One way that this kind of scapegoating plays out post the formation of the nation state is the connection between anti-Semitism and white supremacy. So there's thousands of years of history of Jews being persecuted on a religious basis, right? Jews killed Jesus. There's plenty of tropes. Those tropes are alive and well. But when nationalism is formed, there's a new strain of anti-Semitism that says the problem isn't necessarily that Jews aren't truly Christian, but they're not truly French, they're not truly German, they're not loyal to us. And eugenics, as it's formed, also really has a field day with anti-Semitism. The phrase anti-Semitism was coined in order to make, what was previously called Judenhass in German, just hatred of Jews, sounds scientific and modern and palatable. And we see anti-Semitism deeply embedded today in modern white nationalist ideology. White nationalists, people who believe that people of color are inferior, right? That white people are a superior race, are faced with a logical problem when we see the success of people in color, of people of color, when we see Black excellence or the success of the civil rights movement. Because if people are inferior, how are they freeing themselves? What explains their success? And if you're a white nationalist, you need an answer to that, and the answer they found is the Jews are behind it. The Jews are controlling things. And so that's how you see in white nationalist circles beliefs that the Jews are behind the NAACP or Black Lives Matter because Black people couldn't possibly run their own civil rights organization. That's deeply racist. It's also anti-Semitic. And we're seeing, unfortunately, as the white nationalist movement in this country is gaining power and having a resurgence, we're seeing anti-Semitism have a resurgence along with it. Just one manifestation of white nationalist ideology is something called the Great Replacement Theory, which is the idea that Jews are secretly trying to replace white people with Black and brown people. And that's had devastating impact and led to real violence. So when you see people marching through Charlottesville, chanting, "Jews will not replace us," that's what they are referring to, is that Great Replacement Theory. The mass shooter who killed Jews at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh wrote up a manifesto about how Jews were behind invaders from the global south. He was upset that that congregation had sponsored an event on refugees and asylum seekers and believed in the Great Replacement Theory, and that's why he did what he did. And we've seen great replacement theory also feature in attacks not against Jews. The person who killed people in Christchurch Mosque wrote a manifesto he posted online titled The Great Replacement. The person who walked into a grocery store in Buffalo trying to target black people and also who killed people, posted a manifesto where he identified a typology of Jewish faces with labels like goblin and demon and said, "I'm trying to intimidate the replacers." This is all obviously a completely incoherent, violent ideology. It's also one that's gaining power. On Tucker Carlson's Fox News show, he repeatedly, while he was still on air, said, "The great replacement theory is happening. They don't want you to know, but it's happening." We've heard echoes of great replacement theory in the rhetoric of politicians talking about immigration or implying that George Soros is somehow responsible for asylum seekers arriving at our southern border. This ideology is becoming more and more mainstream, unfortunately. A poll taken by the Southern Poverty Law Center a little over a year ago now found that 2/3 of Republicans in this country believe in fundamental tenets of the Great Replacement Theory. That's a startling number when you think about the violence that that ideology inspires. One way we combat it is by lifting up solidarity between Jews and other groups targeted by this ideology, because it's not separate hatreds. The people who don't want immigrants to be allowed to live also don't want Jews to be allowed to live. The people who don't want Jews to be allowed to live here also don't want black people to be allowed to live here and thrive. White nationalism is a step beyond just white supremacy. White nationalists believe America isn't already racist enough. They want America to be exclusively for white Christians. And I think that's one role that the church has to play, is in rejecting white and Christian nationalism and really firmly saying we believe in being part of a multiracial, multicultural society. And we're gonna reject any form of Christian nationalism, which is deeply connected to white nationalism, wherever we see it appear. Another way that we can combat this is acknowledging that Jews are a multiracial people, because the point of white nationalist ideology is that Jews are this demonic, conspiratorial race, secretly behind everything, and are masquerading as white. But the truth is, Jews are a multiracial people. There are white Jews, and there are Jews of color. There are black Jews. There are Asian Jews. There are Arab Jews. And lifting that up is a threat to the logic of white supremacy, which doesn't believe it's possible to have a cohesive and multiracial people. And we are one. And yeah, finally, I think that recognizing that the way that Jews are safe in a society as a group that is often blamed when things go wrong is creating a society where people are cared for, where everyone gets a chance to thrive, where there's opportunity, where there's safety for everyone, is really deeply important to the fight against anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism doesn't thrive when people are in community with each other and when their needs are met and they feel cared for, which is part of why I do the work that I do as an organizer.
Areas of my focus is in interfaith relations here at the church. I also serve at the level of the Presbytery, which is the network of Presbyterian churches in Chicagoland, on the interfaith committee of that group, trying to take a lead and create opportunities for interfaith engagement there. Through my work there, I've been a longtime participant and currently co-moderate a dialogue group between Presbyterian clergy and rabbis that's happening at the Jewish Federation of Chicago. Several years ago, I also served at the national church level, working with a committee to write a document, a study guide for our Presbyterian Church USA denomination throughout the country. And that document was adopted by the National Conference of our church, the General Assembly, last summer in 2022. It's called Denouncing Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And I'm going to talk about this document a bit tonight. This is very easy to find online. You can just do an internet search for Denouncing Anti-Semitism, PC USA, Presbyterian Church USA, any combination of those words or Islamophobia, and it pops right up as a resource document. So tonight we're focusing on the anti-Semitism portion of that document. What this document does is names anti-Semitism and Islamophobia as sins. So this is getting into some churchy words, and it names them as evil things that the church has been culpable in creating to some degree and reiterating and recreating to some degree throughout history, and we've heard some accounts of that already tonight. So we need to understand where that comes from in our own history so that we can change that, interrupt that, so we can confess and apologize and repent for harm that we as a people have been responsible for and not create any further harm. But we have to learn about that in order to do that. So tonight, as we continue, I'll get deeper into where this shows up in our book of confessions. I brought a copy for show and tell. This is our big book of confessions, but what this means is professions of faith. It's not confession like you might think a confession of sin, although there's some of that in there too. But these are historical professions of our faith that lay out what we believe in different times and places throughout history. So it includes some ancient creeds of early Christians. It includes the Scots Confession, the Heidelberg Catechism, the Westminster Statement of Faith. So a lot of historical professions of faith. And there is some anti-Semitism in there, unfortunately. I'll lift up a few examples. In the document that we wrote, we used two different definitions of anti-Semitism, taken from communities, from either the Jewish community or a group that included members of the Jewish community. So first, I want to talk about the definition from the Anti-Defamation League. And they define, that is a Jewish organization that works for civil rights and inclusion and lifting up and working against defamation when it happens. So their definition of anti-Semitism is the belief or behavior hostile toward Jews just because they are Jewish. It may take the form of religious teachings that proclaim inferiority of Jews, for instance, or political efforts to isolate, oppress, or otherwise injure them. It may also include prejudiced or stereotyped views about Jews. So this definition of anti-Semitism talks about hostility, talks about taught inferiority, isolation, oppression, and injury. It talks about prejudice and stereotyping. And it also calls out religious teaching in particular, and that's where churches like ours need to take a good, hard look. So we all know the name Martin Luther. He began Lutheranism. He launched the Reformation. And he's famous for posting his theses on the door, his statements of disagreement and his beliefs on the door of a Catholic church. But what we know less about is that he also wrote in 1543 a treatise called On the Jews and Their Lies. And in this treatise, Martin Luther encouraged Christians to burn Jewish schools and synagogues, to destroy their prayer books, to prevent their rabbis from teaching, and to take their homes and their money, only to be given back if they converted to Christianity. This is Martin Luther, Lutheran Church, Reformation. I will say the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America has renounced this, as do we, but this is part of our history. Another example is from a confession less well known by people than Martin Luther was, something called the Second Helvetic Confession, which is in our book of Professions of Faith. And this was from the Reformed Church of Switzerland in the 16th century, 23 years after Luther wrote his. This was written in Switzerland, and it says, "But now," meaning 1566, but also meaning since the beginning of the Christian church, but now, since Christ is the true Messiah, since Christ, the true Messiah, is exhibited unto us, and the abundance of grace is poured forth upon the people of the New Testament, the sacraments of the old people, meaning the Jews, the sacraments of the old people are surely abrogated, canceled, and have ceased. And instead, the symbols of the New Testament are placed. Baptism in place of circumcision, the Lord's Supper, communion, in place of the Paschal lamb and sacrifices. So to put this 16th century document in more contemporary language, the Christian sacraments replace the Jewish religious practices, and Christians replace Jews in their relationship with God. So this particular confession or profession of faith was recognized as authoritative in Reformed churches in Switzerland, Scotland, France, Holland, Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, and was later a strong influence on English Puritans and Presbyterians in the early United States. We no longer preach or teach this. We renounce this specific teaching. But a seed of this still resides in Christianity when we claim that one must become Christian in order to be reconciled to God, or in Christian language, in order to be saved. And this is a little something that we continue to wrestle with as Christians. There's an antidote to this teaching that's found in our scriptures in the book of Romans, in what we have called the New Testament, or which we could call the Second Testament or the Christian Testament, if we recognize that what we have historically called the Old Testament is actually the living Hebrew scripture for Jews of today, not old at all, but living and alive and vibrant in Jewish life. But in our Christian Testament, the book of Romans, we find a verse that says, God has not rejected God's people whom he foreknew, the Jews who came before, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. This is in Romans 11. Look at verses 2 and 29 to find these exact words. This is a rejection of the idea that Christians have replaced Jews. And we have made that statement even stronger in another study document, a document of the Presbyterian Church USA in 1987 that said, "We affirm that the church, elected in Jesus Christ, has been engrafted into the people of God, established by the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Therefore, Christians have not replaced Jews." That's the quote from a study document in 1987. So this is also referencing back to that same scripture in Romans, where the church in Romans is being described as being grafted into the Jewish people. We have the root of the Jewish people, and Christians become a branch in that tree, not a new tree to replace the old tree, not a new religion to replace the old religion, but that we're connected to each other. In our ongoing work as the church, we have to keep developing our biblical and theological language and our liturgical practices in worship to affirm the ongoing covenant between the Jewish people and God, as well as our spiritual kinship with the Jewish people and respect for Jewish faith and life. So I'll stop there, but we're going to get deeper into it as we go on with our forum conversation.
Thank you so much, Nanette, and thanks to all three of you. You've been informative and inspiring and provided a very important foundation for the conversation this evening. And I want to remind all of you that if you have your cards, write down your comments and just kind of put it in the air, and an usher or someone from the committee will come by and get it from you, and we will try to get to your questions, okay? Well, you know what the first question is, and I put it to all three of you again. How would you describe the role of the church? You've got the foundation there. In perpetrating anti-Semitism, both historically and today.
Okay. I mean,
Such
like
a
to-
broad question, isn't
I mean,
it?
right, there's some different directions we can take this. I'd like to talk about the Pharisees for a moment. Number one, I have a pet theory that actually, I personally believe that Jesus was a Pharisee. My pet theory is that he was from the house of Hillel, and that the people that are described as the Pharisees were from the house of Shammai, and that they were debating and throwing down the way Jews do, and then a few decades later, by the time the stories got told and everybody was feeling salty, the stories got told in a different way, and it was just the Jews, and we're distancing Jesus from the Jews because he's ours now, and we're not like them anymore. But any which way, whether or not Jesus was, in fact, because he totally holds Beit Hillel positions, I'm sorry, but whether or not he was a Jew, and he was engaging with Jews the way Jews do, and then this story got told, and there is so much sensitivity and unpacking that needs to happen every single time the stories of the Pharisees appear in the Gospels, and they get taken at face value without any critical analysis, and are used to bolster anti-Semitism. And I will just say this very plainly: using Pharisee as a way to communicate that someone is a hypocrite is a slur. It's an anti-Semitic slur. In the same way that a kid in the playground that says to another kid, "Ugh, that's so gay," is homophobic, even though the kid does not mean, "Oh, that is homosexual of you," right? That is queer of you. He is saying that it is bad, and he's using the word gay to connote bad, right? Pharisee means hypocrite. You're saying Jew, right? Pharisee is Jew. The Pharisees are the ancestors of rabbinic Judaism, like literally. Like the Pharisees are the people who then flowed into the ancestors. They are the ancestors of the Mishnah, which is the base of the Talmud. It's what I was trained in, right? Those are my people. I have the title rabbi, just like the Pharisees. Okay, so when you say someone is a Pharisee, you are calling them a Jew. And the church, in so many places, has not done the work to unpack and analyze and really feel their way through this in a way that has integrity. So that is one thing that I think has so much work. And I'm so grateful to Reverend Sawyer for opening up this conversation about the places where harm has been caused, truly, because the thing that I hear so often in Christian spaces, really wonderfully, deeply well-meaning people say, "Oh, well, those people are not real Christians. That's not real Christianity." Except Martin Luther is a real Christian, and Easter pogroms is real Christianity, and the Inquisition is real Christianity, and the murder of all of the Jews in the Rhineland as part of the Crusades is real Christianity, and and so is James Cone, and so is Dr. Martin Luther King, and so is womanist theology, and so is, St. Francis and Julian of Norwich, and all of the bright lights, and all of the things that so many people, including myself, love to hold up as the best of Christianity, right? But it's all there. And I think the true way forward for the church, I say as not connected to the church in any way, but as a Jew, that grappling has to happen, because I experience again and again and again that denial, and it is injurious, and it winds up repeating those harms again. And when we tell the truth, we pave the possibility for a new future.
Reverend Sawyer?
Sure, yeah. You mentioned the scriptures and the gospel, and I'm going to go right there too and give us some specifics about that. Looking at the gospel according to Matthew, it was definitely written to a largely Jewish community that was fighting with itself, and some of the Jews were following the Jewish Jesus, and some Jews were not. And so it's this in-house fighting in those early days. Although I was reminded it was written after the destruction of the temple, so even though it's writing about when Jesus walked the earth, it's written 40 to 80 years later to recount the story. But we have to think about the context in which it happens. So in Matthew, it paints this picture of Jews and Jewish leaders as hypocrites, liars, and murderers. These words are in our scripture, in this account. And Jesus talks about them and their synagogues, distancing his own Jewish followers from those who weren't staying with their community. So there's this distancing that happens in the story. And we Christians can forget and start thinking this is a story about Christians talking about Jews. But it's Jews talking about Jews, Jews who were becoming a new religion, starting to follow this Jewish Jesus. When the Pharisees and the Sadducees, two different sects of Judaism, when those people test Jesus by asking him for a sign, Jesus calls them in this version an evil and adulterous generation. How many Christians have felt very uncomfortable when we read these words in worship? It just feels very uncomfortable, but here it is. We need to talk about it and think about it. And it gets worse, actually. Jesus says to the Pharisees and Sadducees, "You brood of vipers, you snakes. How can you speak good things when you are evil?" This whole idea that Jews are evil, or the root of evil, or the source of evil, this then gets used to scapegoat Jews, to blame them for anything anybody's unhappy with. Oh, it must be the evil Jews. This is one of the stereotypes, the tropes that gets replayed and replayed. In Matthew is the only gospel when the crowds who call for the death of Jesus, they say, Pilate. So here we have the Romans, the telling of the story, trying to make the Roman character, Pilate, more innocent, right? So Pilate's not sure about crucifying Jesus, but the crowd says, "His blood be upon us and upon our children." So no worries, Pilate. You don't have to feel guilty or responsible. We'll take it. And we interpret that to mean that it's a Jewish crowd rather than, say, a Roman crowd at that moment in the courtyard of Pilate. Was that Jews or was that Romans? But it gets interpreted to mean that the Jewish people are responsible for the death of Jesus, even though crucifixion was a Roman Empire method of killing people, thousands of people, in order to terrorize and terrify them into being obedient to the Roman Empire there. But this very idea that the Jews killed Jesus is lodged in the Scots Confession another confession in our book, Professions of Faith. In there it says, and I warned our panelists I'm going to read some ugly words. There it says, Satan has incited cruel murderers to persecute, trouble, and molest the true church and its members, as Cain did to Abel, Ishmael to Isaac, Esau to Jacob, and here it is, the whole priesthood of the Jews to Christ Jesus himself and his apostles after him. So all the Jews killed Jesus and molested all the apostles after that. Holy Week, when we talk about this story of Jesus' death and ultimately resurrection, that week throughout centuries of history has been one of the most violent weeks for Jews, because this gets read in Christian churches and people would get riled up and go and have pogroms and search out Jews and kill them because of this myth, this idea that they were responsible for killing Jesus. So here in our church, you know, we're going to keep telling this story. This is a core story of our faith. But how can we do that responsibly in a world in which we love our Jewish neighbors and seek to live with them in respect and peace? So one of the things we do in our church is during Holy Week, we print an educational piece in the worship bulletin. And I brought it to read to you. This is in our bulletin, a note on Holy Week and anti-Semitism. The Passion texts, the stories of the Passion of Jesus, the stories of his death, can pose problems for Christian-Jewish relations. For centuries, many Christians blamed the Jews, in quotes, for Christ's death. This interpretation is incorrect, misguided, and dangerous. In fact, crucifixion was solely a Roman form of punishment, one used to frighten subjugated peoples into obeying Roman authority. Tragically, Christians have misused the reading of the Passion to foment violent anti-Semitic pogroms. Anti-Semitism still plagues the world. We read these texts with sensitivity and caution, remembering the cruelties and the failures of our past. And I'm thinking right now we should maybe add another sentence about, and we therefore commit to not doing that harm in the future. So that's an example of how the church has been culpable in recreating and reproducing anti-Semitism.
Thank you. Becca?
Yes. I'll leave discussion of church doctrine to my co-panelists who know much more than I do. What I can say about the role of the church is that I think one thing I often see missing from interfaith spaces and interfaith dialogue is an acknowledgement of power dynamics between communities and the context that we are in America now, which is one of Christian hegemony. And what I mean by that is a set of assumptions that whatever is Christian is normative, is the default. I mean, an example is I grew up with Christmas off every year, and often school or cross-country meets on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish holy days. There are countless examples of the way that Christianity is kind of normative, even of the ways that in conversations about Jewishness written by a non-Jewish audience, I see the lens that we look at Jewish issues and the set of assumptions made as quite Christian. And I think it's important to acknowledge that context. There's a phrase I also hear a lot, Judeo-Christian values, which that phrase I think is well-meaning and is meant to be pluralistic. It's meant to uplift Jewishness. What I hear when I hear Judeo-Christian values is Islamophobia, honestly. I hear it as an intentional framing that positions Jews as somehow aligned with Christianity in opposition to Islam and other cultures. And, as I said, one of the ways anti-Semitism works is distancing Jews from other marginalized groups. I see philo-Semitism as one manifestation of this, which the fetishization of Jewish people. I think that we see this with people who will talk about Jews in ways that serve their political purposes and are not really rooted in Jewish safety. We've seen that with Marjorie Taylor Greene, for just one example, who will spread conspiracy theories about the Rothschilds using space lasers to create wildfires in California, and then will also call Congresswoman Ilhan Omar a terrorist for talking about Palestinian rights, and will use the framing of Jewish lives matter, but clearly is not speaking in a place of concern for actual living, breathing Jewish people. And so I think one role that the church has is rejecting that, is in the same way that it's important for the church to fight anti-Semitism, to also really grapple and contend with Islamophobia in all of our spaces, including religious spaces. And finally, I think that we are at a moment where around the world societies are facing a choice between ethnic nationalism and multiracial democracy. And there's people in this country who want this to be a country for white Christians. And it is incumbent upon faith communities and Christian communities to be really vocal against that and for a multiracial, multicultural society.
Thank you. I told you it was going to be a master class. The next question that we have is the anti-Semitic incidents that are alarmingly increasing across the United States and even here in Illinois. In your opinion, what factors appear to be driving this uptick, especially the violent episodes? And you mentioned earlier, I think, Becca, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Oh, you can't hear me? Is that better? Wow, thank you. The uptick in factors that are driving anti-Semitic incidents in the United States and across Illinois. Who would like to start with that one? Thank you.
I think we are seeing a rise in anti-Semitism that is parallel to and deeply connected to a rise in white nationalism, in anti-immigrant violence and rhetoric, in Islamophobia, because those oppressions are all interconnected. And they're being intentionally spread and weaponized for political purposes by politicians who have a theory of how they are going to get power by dividing communities against each other and spreading hatred and fear. It's important to name that anti-Semitism can exist in any political space because it's baked into our society, just like misogyny or racism or homophobia can exist in any space regardless of political affiliation. But it's important to recognize that the only people who actually benefit from anti-Semitism are those politicians who are trying to use it to stay in power or get into power through that politics of hatred and fear, making people afraid of their neighbors. And when we see anti-Semitism show up in movements for justice and equality for people, it weakens those movements. So it can show up anywhere, but it only benefits certain people and political actors, and it only hurts certain people and political actors. And I think that's important to acknowledge as we address anti-Semitism, because we need to be clear about where is education needed and deeper understanding and deeper relationship building. And that sometimes means staying in relationship through challenging moments and being able to hold discomfort, being able to hold deep relationships even with people who we have tension or disagreement with, and who is using anti-Semitism to their benefit, and which movements and actors just kind of need to be defeated.
Rabbi, you're nodding your head.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, in relationships of solidarity, it has to be education, right? And we have to find our way through. And Christian nationalism is on the rise. The new Speaker of the House is quite explicitly a white Christian nationalist. He believes that God put him there. And I don't think he thinks that God put him there to create a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy. That's not his thing at all. These are terrifying times. And during times of tension, conspiracy theories go up. And Jews are the punchline of every single conspiracy theory. Play the game. Find a conspiracy theory, unspool it, and you will find the creamy center is the Jews did it. Right? QAnon, at its base, anti-Semitism. Not just anti-Semitism, blood libel. Right? We are going back to the Middle Ages, that game of, okay, I don't have to confess that I killed the kid because now, or we don't know who, the kid went missing, but we can blame the Jews, right? QAnon is a blood libel at its root. The whole disgusting anti-trans movement has a backstory about how the Pritzkers are behind it and the Soros is behind it, and and then if you go deep enough into the people who are really, really, really driving the worst of the anti-trans theory in this country, you will find people who it gets bizarre, the reptilian lizard people who are ultimately Jews. It's like the Jewish lizard people are funding this, transhumanist movement to deprive everybody of gender. It's like, no, just some people need health care and they should have it. Like maybe people should have access to the health care they need. But the whole story, it's once again, like, God forbid people should have access to the health care they need just because they deserve health care. No, the Jews have an agenda that they are driving secretly because they're trying to get us all, right? And every single place where people who are insecure, this is a big moment, right? And some of it is because we had a black president, and we had this moment of like, oh God, like the whole paradigm, the whole white supremacist paradigm under which our country has existed could possibly change, even though, honestly, it's so symbolic in so many ways. Obama did not magically undo structural racism, unfortunately. But this threat sort of brought everybody into this terror moment, and then people started to see the progress that we had made as a society, and the conspiracy theories started to roll, and Jews are at the bottom of all of them. And so we both have all of this anti-immigrant hate happening, and Islamophobia, and various, tons of anti-black terrorism. There are the hate, and the transphobia is horrific right now, right? The hatred of someone who is not like me is massive, and Jews are at the end of the rainbow of every single conspiracy theory. And So the greater the time of tension, the more people are looking for a scapegoat, and so that becomes the answer to the anti-Semitism. It does not answer, the answer to transphobia specifically is different. The answer to homophobia specifically is different. And
It's already 7:30.
yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in. I want to give a couple more examples of how anti-Semitism is showing up. It was already on the uptick before the war happened. I think the war is also bringing out an even more of an increase in anti-Semitic incidences and hate speech and so on. To kind of ground that, I'll talk about the document again that I mentioned, the Denouncing Anti-Semitism document. I said we used two definitions of anti-Semitism. The second definition we used was from a group called the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism. And this was their definition: discrimination. Anti-Semitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews, or against Jewish institutions as Jewish. So we chose this definition because it in the pages of materials that give examples and talk about what that one sentence means, they get into talking about the very complex and nuanced conversation about when or whether anti-Zionism ever becomes anti-Semitic. So that's very controversial. And it's been very controversial in our denomination too. Lots of arguments and conversation about that. The Jewish Declaration of Anti-Semitism was written and published in March of 2021, just to give you some context. It's also pretty easy to find online if you search for it. The Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism. It was put together by an international group of scholars, so it's the work of academics, scholars from the fields of Jewish, Holocaust, Israel, Palestine, and Middle East studies. Scholars from all these different kinds of study came together and wrote this document. So briefly, it states that it describes when statements about Israel-Palestine become anti-Semitic and when they're not anti-Semitic on the face of it. That's one of their phrases. Even when it's not anti-Semitic on the face of it, you have to dig down and look behind, like, who said it, where'd they say it, what was the intention when they said it. Maybe it was also anti-Semitic, but we got to work. We got to really study it. So we're definitely not going into deep conversations about the war or the conflict tonight, but I'm just going to skirt around the edges a little bit and give you two examples of where where anti-Semitism is popping out in relation to the conflict. So the Jerusalem Declaration states that something is anti-Semitic when holding Jews collectively responsible for Israel's conduct. So this means whenever Jews around the world, anywhere, are attacked physically or verbally, or in any way harmed as retribution for something that the state of Israel or their military has done, that's anti-Semitic. That's collectively punishing people just because they're Jews and they have some connection to Israel through their identity. They are not, that is anti-Semitic. Another example is requiring people, because they're Jewish, to publicly condemn Israel or Zionism, for example, like at a political meeting, but not requiring other people, non-Jews, or other institutions, non-Jewish institutions, not requiring them to make any political statements about their feeling or their opinions about Israel, Palestine. So this kind of thing might exclude Jews from meetings or from rallies or from events or discussions if they won't publicly condemn Israel or Zionism. So these are two examples that are coming up currently.
I'd love to add one thing to that. I know we have to move to audience questions in a moment, but you raised the question of when does anti-Zionism, like is or isn't that anti-Semitic? Like when does it become anti-Semitic? There's a question I'm not sure we'll get to about how can Christians be in solidarity with Jews or do a process of repair around anti-Semitism. And there's a saying in the Jewish community, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, which means that the answer can't necessarily be just do whatever any Jewish person says, because we're not all going to agree to each other. Our community is complex and holds many different sets of politics. And so that means that you have a responsibility as an individual person to sort through as many perspectives as possible and try to find for yourself clarity around what a deep commitment to Jewish safety looks like. And for me, what I use to guide that is the principle that all people deserve safety, that all people deserve equality and freedom and to be seen and recognized, and that has to be applied universally, meaning I want to explicitly say, like, support for the safety of Palestinian people or the freedom of Palestinian people isn't an act of anti-Semitism. And that's my personal perspective as a member of a community with a million personal perspectives. And so I encourage also conversations with people in your Jewish community about what support for their safety looks like and means to them.
Thank you. We do have a format for this evening, and we are going to get to your questions. And we do have one more question to ask you before we do the Q&A from the audience. Do you have any thoughts about the ways non-Jewish houses of worship, such as Fourth Church, can combat anti-Semitism? And what could restoration and repair look like in healing those relationships? I know you were waiting for that one, weren't you? Yes, I know.
Oh, good. So, according to Maimonides, listen, not according to me, I'm gonna go back to one of our guys. Maimonides was a 12th century philosopher, Torah scholar, physician, overachiever, brilliant guy. Anyway, one of his great gifts to the Jewish people was a compendium of laws that changed the face of Judaism, and one subset of that was the laws of repentance, wherein he, as with other things, took the wisdom from the Talmud and elsewhere and kind of rearranged it in a new order. You know, he sort of took a bunch of things that were floating around and sort of put it in a new order. And as I read Maimonides, there are 5 steps to the work of repentance. Owning fully the harm caused, which is, I mean, tonight, right, is a big, huge part of that. Like, you name it, you own it. Starting to change. Like, what can you do different starting today, tomorrow, that is different from what has been? Amends, which in many cases in repair relationships is, maybe it's like financial, but maybe it's time, maybe it's a project, maybe it's, it doesn't have to be remuneration. But, in some cases that's appropriate, in many cases maybe it's something else. Some kind of amend, like what is the thing you're gonna do to repair that hole in the universe, to sew it up. You can't undo, but you can sew up. So own confession, start to change, amends, then apology, right? Why is apology down here? Because if you apologize before you've actually started to actually change, to fully own it, to do the work, what is that apology? But if you're apologizing already after you've been doing this deep transformational work, it's a different thing, and it's coming from a different place, and you're different, right? And so that apology is different. And it changes you, and it changes the other person in a different way. And then step 5 is when you have the chance to do the thing, that harmful thing again, naturally and organically, you make a different choice.
Wonderful. Absolutely. A way to live your life.
Easy, right?
A brief comment on that question, or could we go to Q&A? Are you ready? Okay. And I know the rabbi can speak to this one. Can you speak a little about the Jewish people expelled from Spain?
Yes.
Just a little.
Just a little. 1492 was a big year for not just the indigenous people of this plot of land, of Turtle Island, but also the Jews were expelled from Spain and left. I mean, we went all over the place. I'm not Sephardi, but Jews went to North Africa, to Turkey, to Greece, to Italy. I mean, you can picture, right? And some went to Holland, to Amsterdam, and kind of all over the Mediterranean, Syria, what's now the land of Israel, and what's now so Sfarad is the Hebrew word for Spain, and so Sephardi Jews have their own unique culture, and it flourished in these different places in many different ways. The language Ladino, which is a mixture of Hebrew and Spanish, continued to grow and change and evolve in these places. Kabbalah, which is one of the threads of Jewish mystical practice, was born in Spain, and then many of the refugees from the Spanish expulsion wound up in the land of Israel. People don't know this. And so the huge flowering of Kabbalah that happened in the 16th century in Israel is actually all people who were kicked out of Spain. Yeah, I don't know what else you want to know, but there is an amazing book called The Jews of Spain that can tell you more.
I can add a little bit. I mean, that was an example of some serious Christian anti-Semitism, too, because it was the Christian monarch who, there was a period of forcing Jews to convert to Christianity. If they didn't convert, they were killed or expelled, I believe, late 1300s and into the 1400s. Then later, around the 1492 time, even those who had converted were suspect and sometimes also expelled. Their property was stolen from them as they were expelled, and the wealth that the Christian monarchs gained from that were used to finance Christopher Columbus's trip to discover this land and also to begin the Atlantic slave trade. So Christian anti-Semitism was a root, involved in all of those terrible harms.
Okay, this is your last chance to write down your comment and your question to put it up there. We have a few minutes left, and I have one more from the audience. I understand that it was easy to use Jews as scapegoats, but why is there so much hate by Muslims and blacks, particularly when so many Jews have gone out of their way to help both groups? Yes.
I think anti-Semitism can be found in any place, in many communities, because it is unfortunately part of the fabric of our society. Again, like misogyny or homophobia. And so I would challenge or push back on the narrative that in some way the Black or Muslim community are uniquely anti-Semitic. I think there's perhaps a bit of white supremacy and Islamophobia in some of those assumptions. I think, yes, anti-Semitism exists in those communities. It also exists in white and Christian communities. And I also, I've heard a narrative before that Jews have, I just don't like the framing of Jews have done so much for those communities. One, because solidarity isn't transactional or reciprocal. That's not the way it works in the relationships and the kind of solidarity I aim to demonstrate and the kind of relationships I try to build. It's not that people are exchanging favors, it's that people are in relationship and really deeply committed to each other's safety. And, certainly there were Jews that participated in the civil rights movement and marched with Dr. Martin Luther King. There were also Jews who aligned with white moderates and did not participate in those movements. And I also think that I am much less interested in what American Jews have done to show solidarity with Black folks in this country 50 years ago. I'm interested in what we're doing now to be in solidarity with movements like Black Lives Matter, what we're doing now to be in solidarity with our Muslim neighbors. I see plenty of examples of that kind of deep solidarity, and I also see plenty of really beautiful examples of that kind of solidarity from Muslims and Black folks with the Jewish community in moments when we are in danger.
Very important community organizing work.
For sure.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to name is that, at the beginning of the 20th century, American Jews and American Black community were in deep, deep solidarity and relationship. And Yiddish papers would describe lynchings as pogroms. Like there's a really deep relationship, understanding, connection, and even like the American Black community was key for agitating for American involvement in World War II because of the persecution of Jews. And there was an understanding that we were going to fight the war abroad and then come home and fight the war at home, which was the war against white supremacy. And the GI Bill happened, and whiteness expanded to include Jews who had skin color like mine. And Jews took the benefits of the GI Bill, but redlining and other forms of systemic racism prevented Black Americans from benefiting in the same way. And then, so Jews grabbed, and Jews, you remember, this is like the Holocaust happened, the trauma, the opportunity to be part of whiteness and safety was so alluring, and Jews, for the most part, ran towards that opportunity. Like, yes, I'd like to be less persecuted, please. And then after the Civil Rights Bill, which not only prevented discrimination against race, theoretically, but also, it banned it, but also discrimination against creed. And then whiteness expanded to include Jews in a whole other way. And so, ironically, fighting the war against racism at home enabled Jews to assimilate into whiteness in a whole other way. And so when you take the trope of the Jew who is economically comfortable, right, the whole money lending thing, and maybe secretly running things, right, and we've got all of these old conspiracy theories, and now American Jews are not only all of that, but they're white and read to have power, and like Jews got in on the ground floor of Hollywood because nobody else would let us in. There were no other industries for us, and then Hollywood did well, and everybody was mad at us because we were actually there at the right time in the right place, and so the narratives spin out, and these old relationships of solidarity start to change as Jews' class status changes, and that's real. And a fracture happened. And some Jews have always been in it for the long haul and in those relationships. And in some cases, particularly institutionally, there was a real fracture there's still repair work that needs to happen. And I think we can just name that and say that that's real. And American Jews are still grappling with their relationship to whiteness in complicated ways.
Thank you. Our topic this evening is understanding anti-Semitism. And so in our final minutes, there's one more question that we're going to take on. How much of anti-Semitism today is related to Israel's treatment of the Palestinians versus the Jewish religion? And I ask you to be brief, and that's a horrible thing to say. I apologize ahead of time.
No, go for it.
No.
I will say when there is an army with Jewish stars on its uniforms committing violence, I think that is not good for Jewish safety. I also think, as was named, collectively holding Jews responsible for Israel's actions is a form of anti-Semitism, and I think it's important that everyone draw distinctions and resist the urge to equate all Jewish people with the state of Israel. I also think anti-Semitism comes from many, many other sources. Anti-Semitism certainly predates the state of Israel, and can be found in many other places as well. And I don't know if I have a percentage of what comes from where, but I think one thing that makes Jews safer is movements that are multi-faith and multiracial and include Jews that are fighting for safety of all people. And I feel proud of the ways that the Jewish communities I'm part of are moving to be part of those movements in this moment and demanding the safety of all people. And I think it keeps everyone safe when everyone is on the side of universal safety and liberation.
Before we turn it back over, I want to say thank you so much to the Rabbi Danya Rutenberg, Becca Lubo, and the Reverend Annette Sawyer. You have spoken not only from your areas of expertise, but from your hearts, and we are truly grateful. Thank you.
I want to thank you all for coming this evening, and especially for your very evocative questions. And many of the questions that you asked this evening, even though they were not addressed directly, we will take into consideration as we move forward with more on this particular topic. And I want to say that I am really embarrassed to have left out a couple other thank yous. One is to Ira Pilchin, who is on our council committee and an amazing, amazing contributor to this topic, as well as Reverend Amanda Green from Chicago Sinai Congregation, who I believe may be in the room this evening. So we're very, very grateful to you for your, thank you, there you are, then for all of your consultation on this particular topic tonight. So very grateful to you. So, and I want to thank our panelists, as you already have done, and also our amazing moderator and all that has gone into this. So thank you again for coming out this evening for this topic.